Hello second years, welcome to your first topic on issues and debates. So this will be on paper 3, so it's the only topic that I teach on paper 3 and it will sit alongside your other 3 topics that you're doing with Andy. There are 2 issues, gender bias, which you'll look at this week, and cultural bias, which you'll look at next week, and then there are 4 debates, I believe. You do have an image of the specification on the front of your flipped learning book. The debates are, let me check if there's 4, there's nature versus nurture, free will versus determinism, holism versus reductionism, and idiographic versus nomothetic approach. And then you have ethical issues, which we started exploring in the first year, and we're going to just extend that a little bit further to a slightly more complex level for your second year. Okay. Whilst issues and debates generally are quite different to the topics that you've studied recently and the structuring of them, the 2 that are probably the most similar, so easier and quite gently, are gender and cultural bias. So when we talk about the debates, you won't be surprised to hear that we approach the 16 markers as more of a debate process rather than strengths and weaknesses. So we talk about for and against as opposed to supporting and opposing evidence, although we can use supporting and opposing evidence. But gender bias and cultural bias are perhaps traditionally more that clear structure of AO1 and AO3, mostly because it's widely accepted by most, but not all psychologists, that in the past definitely and currently, although this is open for slightly more debate, that gender bias and cultural bias have impacted psychological research. So, because it's a new topic, I thought I'd just show you a couple of the types of questions you might have. These have all been past questions apart from the last one. So this one, you've got a stimulus like you've seen before, and you have to explain how the newspaper headline might be an example of beta bias, which is something that a term that you'll be familiar with by the end of the video, hopefully, if it's done its job, and suggest one way psychologists might address the problem of beta bias in their research. And then there's an additional question, because as you all know, on paper 3, paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3, there could be research methods questions. So this one suggests an alternative measure that would overcome the problem of the measure that's in the stimulus as well. So there's some research methods. You can't even escape it in issues and debates. The top question is also an example of a past question. So briefly outline one problem associated with alpha bias and one problem associated with beta bias, and discuss then this bottom one, 16 marker, could come up. As you all know, 16 markers could be on any of the topics, but it hasn't yet come up. Now, I don't necessarily know whether that means it will or it won't. It just means it hasn't come up yet. So discuss issues with gender bias in psychological research for 16 marks. So, gender bias, and these images will be explained shortly. Gender bias is something that has haunted psychology and many other areas of scientific research, and obviously in the broader context of the world as well. In psychology, the claim is, or the aim, the desire is, what we should be going for is universality, or universal theories and pieces of research. So universality is the idea that any conclusions drawn from theories or research can be applied to everybody, regardless of any of their characteristics, such as gender and culture, but many others as well, age, etc. So if psychology was truly effective, it would be able to develop theories that could be applied to everybody and explain all behaviour. So quite a lot of those theories would have to allow for differences in gender and culture, etc. And the reason for the faces, fearful, angry, sad, happy, disgusted and surprised, is an example of a universal theory which can be universally applied. And it's based on the evolutionary approach and the idea that all humans, all humans, all cultures, all genders have these set 7 facial expressions. So everybody, all cultures, when they're happy, they have a facial expression which resembles a smile. All cultures, when they're fearful or when they've had a surprise, the facial features, the way the face responds to those emotions doesn't change. Okay, and generally that's found to be the case. So that is a universal theory that can be applied to everybody. However, There are issues with bias. So the definition of bias is treating one person or a group differently from others without justification or evidence. So considering or drawing lines between one person or a group of people without justifiable reason. So and there we have, we'll come back to Bowlby in a second. And then if we apply that particularly to gender bias and psychology, that's theories and research that treat genders differently without justification. So there's a claim, potentially poorly conducted research claim that men and women are different, when actually the research methods can't hold that up because the research is done poorly, or theories that then don't have research that supports their claims, or have research that's poorly conducted or manipulated in some way. Now, it's really important to be aware that gender bias doesn't happen. Sometimes it can do. Sometimes it can be a conscious decision to treat genders differently, but more significantly, especially now, because generally it's accepted that gender bias, or as we might call it in non-psychological areas, sexism isn't accepted. So it might be an unconscious approach as well. So to put it straight into context for you, an example of a piece of research and a theory, because it's the two, I suppose, joined together. You've got Bowlby's 44 Thieves and you've got Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. And that found, as you know, that children who experienced specifically, according to Bowlby, maternal deprivation, so the mother not being there being a break from the primary caregiver of the mother, they assumed that it was the primary caregiver, specifically the mother, would go on to become affectionless psychopaths. And that is a very gender biased piece of research, because as you know now, there is research to suggest that the role of the father is equally as important. The importance of having a primary attachment, doesn't matter whether it's male or female, mother, father, another caring figure from somewhere else, in the family, grandparents, not within the family, just a significant attachment figure is what supports people to have positive attachments as an adult as well and live a healthy life. So therefore that is gender bias, because Bowlby specifically talked about the mother, and there's an argument to put that into context. Bowlby's theory was done not long after the Second World War has ended, and throughout the Second World War men went off to fight and women took on the jobs that traditionally men would have held, such as working in factories. When men returned, they found that women didn't want to give up their jobs. They quite enjoyed going to work. They quite enjoyed having the pay that came from work. So there's a suggestion that Bowlby's theory indicated that women are particularly women, and depriving children of maternal role models would have an impact on their children, with the motivation to encourage them to return to the home. So Bowlby's research particularly impacts working mothers, and that can be seen right up till today. Okay, so the fact that this gender bias exists impacts and makes it not possible for universality or theories that are universal to be developed. So there's this issue of bias, and there are several different types of bias. So alpha bias is the overemphasis of gender differences, and this can lead to the concept, or sits hand in hand with the concept, of essentialism. So the sociobiological theory is the idea that it's a biological belief that men have evolved to want to impregnate as many women as possible, and therefore they seek out short-term relationships, which is the fancy psychological term for one-night stands, because then they can move on to the next woman, impregnate her, and keep moving around. The flip side of that is that sociobiological theory suggests that women seek out long-term relationships because when they're pregnant, they need to be cared for and looked after. So they want a mate that will stay around and care for them while they're growing a child. They can't look after themselves, and when they're vulnerable, when they've got the child. So you've got to bear in mind that this theory is based on the idea of evolution. So the idea that all of our behaviours came from a time when there weren't modern conveniences. So when humans were very exposed to the elements, to predators, all of those things. So that was the idea that men sort out short-term relationships because they could pass on their genes quite quickly and move to the next woman, whereas women sought out long-term relationships because they wanted to be protected and were particularly vulnerable to lots of the kind of risks of predators and things when they were pregnant and when they were breastfeeding and caring for the child. So that concept, that theory, very much overemphasizes that stereotypical. Well, first of all, it suggests that men and women are wildly different in the way they seek out relationships, but it also overemphasizes those traditional gender roles, that concept that men want one-night stands and women always want commitment and long-term relationships. And if that was completely true, then men and women could never have relationships, because men would only ever want long-term relationships and women would only ever want men would only ever want women that would want short-term relationships, and they don't exist. So men wouldn't be able to have relationships, and women only ever want long-term relationships, and all men only want one-night stands, so they don't exist either. So if that theory was true, then there wouldn't be relationships between humans, and clearly there is, and clearly there are humans, men and women, who seek out short-term relationships, and men and women who seek out long-term relationships, and at different stages in their lives as well. So challenging that idea. Essentialism, which fits in with this, is the idea that gender differences are inevitable and fixed. So therefore, absolutely all men, it's inevitable all men will want one-night stands, and it will inevitable all women will want relationships, and that is fixed and there is no variation. But just the existence of relationships suggests that's not the case. Freud is also another example of penis envy, of alpha bias with penis envy. So he wildly overemphasized the gender differences between boys and girls. So we'll look at the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex soon. And the Oedipus complex, as we know, is that the male child is physically attracted to the mother, and the Electra complex is the idea that the female child is attracted to the father. So Freud here, so this is what I should mention as well, an additional thing to alpha bias. So it does overemphasize gender differences, but I always remember it as alpha male or top dog. So if you ever hear of the alpha male top dog, it's the idea that both gender differences are overemphasized, but alpha, one gender, is generally regarded as the superior gender to the other. And that's really important, particularly for Freud's example, because Freud argued that women have penis envy, suggesting that women are morally inferior. Another thing he does suggest is they're morally inferior as well, but Freud suggested that women were inferior, and therefore the fact they were lacking a penis, they would have penis envy. So there's a difference between the genders, and also that being male is better, and that women desire having a penis. They physically want a penis for themselves, and they are jealous of men that have them, suggesting that the penis is the kind of the ideal, and that women are missing that. It's not that they're different, it's that they're different and that one's better than the other. Just as an aside, something that you're aware of and you could talk about in psychodynamic approach, which we're going to look at later on, and also in this as well, is again reinforcing those gender stereotypes. So women have penis envy, and the way that they feel that desire is because they can't have a penis, they replace it with having a child instead. And that would explain why women have a desire to bear children. And men, and then therefore the assumption would be that because men have a penis, they don't really want children, but it's something that they support the women to do. So differences between men and women, one gender is better than the other. And we'll talk about in a minute this idea of, there are two terms for this idea of men being better than women and women being better than men. Then we've got beta bias, and this is the idea that gender differences are minimised. So we don't acknowledge that there are gender differences. And the most common way that you would see this is in an all-male is the idea that we use an all-male sample and then we can apply it to women, because men and women are not different in any way. So we can take the findings from men and apply them to women. So alpha bias and beta bias, neither is good. You shouldn't overemphasize or assume that gender differences exist, or you shouldn't ignore them and minimize them and assume that findings found on men can just be applied to women. We should do true research that looks at that. So Kohlberg's theory of moral development is the idea that Kohlberg did some research and found that the moral development, just like cognitive development, is developed in stages. So stages, and as you go through them in ages. So very similar to Piaget's stages of cognitive development as well. He did some research on all male samples. He only used all male samples, and I'm sure you can think of lots of other pieces of research that use all male samples. And he found that using these examples, he read this scenario of somebody called Heinz who had a poorly wife and he couldn't afford the drugs, and he had to decide whether he was going to steal the drugs to help her get better from the hospital or from the pharmacist. And depending on the answer that was given by the children, Freud found generally they fell into stages. So generally children of a certain age would all give similar answers. Older children would all give similar answers as well. And Freud developed these stages of moral development. And he then, whilst he only used a male sample, he developed this theory that was then applied to both men and women. And it was generally, whenever we use Kohlberg's theory of moral development, we generally find that women are morally inferior. So they don't develop through all the stages in the way that men do. So generally we find all men develop all the way through to the final stage, whereas women get caught on some of the lower stages. So it suggests that their morals were more childlike. That is not because women are morally inferior. It's because we minimise the gender differences, and we'll touch on that a little bit more at the moment. But it's the idea that we had an all-male sample, and therefore we just applied it to women without testing it and doing some more research. And then fight or flight and tend or befriend. So a lot of the research into fight or flight when it very first happened was in animals in laboratory settings. And as we know, in laboratory settings and lab studies, we want everything to be as controlled as possible. Well, something that is more stable and has less fluctuations over time is hormones in male animals. So male animals don't have those same hormone fluctuations that female animals have. So we're talking about the menstrual cycle here and being fertile. So male animals are favoured in lab experiments over female animals for that reason. So therefore, a lot of the research on fight or flight was done on male animals and then taken not only from animals to humans, but from male animals to female humans. So it was applied. However, research more recently has been conducted that's found that actually women's fight or flight is actually more like tend or befriend, and that's the idea that they would tend, their overriding urges are to tend for specifically offspring, but anybody, and befriend other women, because men were out fighting and so were out hunting, so they'd have to, if something came along, they'd have to fight it and kill it and take it back to the tribe. Again, we're talking about evolution, or they would run away from it if it was too big and it was going to kill them. Women, on the other hand, had very different roles because they had to stay and care for the offspring because they were tied by the fact that they would feed for them. They had to breastfeed them. Again, many years ago, thousands of years ago, before modern conveniences were developed. So they didn't develop fight or flight in the same way. They developed tend or befriend because that suited their evolutionary likelihood of survival more. So if they were more likely to tend for their offspring and care for them because they would pass on their genes, and they were also more likely to befriend the other women around them who would also protect them and help them if anything happened. So it's that idea that we've minimised the gender differences. Oh, well, all male lab animals act like this, we can apply it to everybody, and actually that's not the case. Generally, what we find as well is that beta bias can cause androcentrism. And androcentrism is the idea that normal behaviour is judged based according to a male standard. And you'll find lots of other similar concepts in other areas of research. So sometimes we refer to this as the male gaze. So the idea that we're using a male kind of viewpoint to judge all behaviours. So, and this androcentrism is generally a consequence of beta bias, because we've minimised gender differences and all the research suggests you should behave this way, but all the research is based on a male sample. When women act differently, then it's considered abnormal. And this is where we've got care ethics versus justice ethics. So if we go back to Kohlberg's theory of moral development and the idea that women were morally inferior, that actually wasn't the case. It was that because we applied it, we took an all-male sample, men generally have a much more justice ethic, so, or moral, so more based on justice, whether it was right or wrong, from a kind of a justice point of view. Whereas females, actually, they did some, Gilligan did some research on this, exactly the same process as Kohlberg, and developed a new theory for women, and generally found that women have a much more care-based ethical or moral system. So they would do what was right to care for somebody, whereas men are more likely to do something that's right or wrong based on justice, on fairness. So that would also, I guess, in theory, you could argue that might fit a little bit into the idea of tend and befriend, but don't complicate those two. So because of that, where androcentrism comes in is the idea that if people have make moral choices based on caring for people rather than justice, that's seen as abnormal, because research tells us, and a normal behaviour is considered to be having an ethic based on justice, because we're using the male standard, not the female standard. Another example of this might be the idea of masculine faces being seen as more competent. So Obuck and Tudorov, I don't know, apologies. So if you just spell it right, that'll be fine in the exam. They found that they did photo fits with faces, so they could keep the face very similar, but they could change the masculine and feminine elements of it. And generally it was found that masculine faces, the more masculine a face, the more competent it was considered. And it's the idea of these normal behaviours judged based to a male standard. So having a male face makes you more competent. Okay. And there is an alternative term for this. We're all about balance and fairness here. So there is gynocentrism, which is the idea that normal behaviour is judged based according to, that says male standard, apologies, that should be a female standard. Based to a female standard. I did a little bit of reading. I couldn't find many examples of gynocentrism, so I've not included any here, but if you can think of any, particularly those on the spec, that would be really, really good, and you're more than welcome to do some more reading and research as well. Okay, so that's all the AO1. The terms you must know on the spec are gender bias, universality, alpha and beta bias, and androcentrism. So most of them on there. The only ones you don't have to know, but it might be useful for you to be aware of, are bias and gynocentrism. But you don't have to know those. Okay. And then we have AO3, so evaluation of gender bias. Okay, so an issue or a weakness of gender bias, and I'd be really careful to talk about strengths and weaknesses here. This is more, I would perhaps lead with, for the first time ever, I'm saying don't use signposting for this one, because there aren't really any strengths to gender bias as such. They're all, gender bias is a problem, but something you could say an issue around gender bias, or something to consider about gender bias is, and then I've given you lots of examples of the impact of gender bias, and I would like you to pick the ones that make the most sense to you. You do not need to know them all. Pick one or two examples that stick in your mind. Okay, so obviously an issue with gender bias is that it does have a huge impact on society, and psychological research that is gender bias and psychological theories that are gender bias add to the societal gender imbalance that exists. Okay, for example, and I focused mostly on workplace discrimination, however there are lots of other areas as well. 95% of receptionists, secretaries and care assistants, so if you think care, a female, and if you think back to Kohlberg's theory, or what Freud suggested about wanting to care or tend and befriend, any of those things, they fit very much into that idea, that stereotypical view that women should be carers, so receptionists, making sure people are okay, legal secretaries, so secretaries having work checking that, supporting other people, and then care assistants providing care. Whereas 85% of investment bankers, so a well considered, more aggressive, traditionally masculine role, is fulfilled by males. Okay, there is still a clear gender pay gap. So this is the idea, and there's two different terms, but I'll talk only about the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap is where organisations collect data about how much men and women earn. They work out the average salary of a man and the average salary of the woman, and the difference between those salaries is considered the pay gap. And generally, it's found, if you have a look a bit further down, men on average earn 8% more an hour than women do. Okay, so there is a difference, and that can be quite clearly linked back to because the more you look at it, the more pronounced it comes. If you we consider part-time care, because consistently women are part-time workers. Part-time work, because consistently women are part-time workers, because they're expected to stay and consistently provide the care for the children. So they're more likely to stay at home and look after the children. And you think about what Bowlby told us about women, if you have maternal deprivation and maternal deprivation only, you'll become an affectionless psychopath. So even today, I mean, Bowlby was nearly 50 years ago now, and potentially is still having an impact, telling us that it should be women who stay home and care for the children, because they are the biggest ones that have an impact if they're not home caring for the child. However, even though research since then has suggested that that's not the case. On the 14th of November is the Equal Pay Day, which is because of pay inequality. It's the idea that from the 14th of November until the end of the year, so until the 31st of December, women are essentially working for free, because that's what the gender pay gap is. Because they get paid less than men for doing the same roles, that is when they start working, because they work the same amount of time as men. That's when they start working for free. They work over how much the average pay is for a man. It's also found to be that 78% of UK's biggest companies have found a gender pay gap. So there has been legislation that's been brought in recently where companies employing over 250 employees must produce a gender pay gap report. This is to kind of make it more public, so people are aware. West Knox College do produce one of these, which I'm sure you're all keen to Google and find out about. And 78% of UK's biggest companies have found to have an unequal pay in men and on average in men and women's pay. So there isn't specifically men and women who are doing the same job who are being paid differently, although that is a thing that exists and there is evidence of that somewhere. The gender pay gap talks about on average. So in the biggest companies, the average man, or the average salary for a man, is bigger than the average salary for a woman within that organisation. And there's also something called the motherhood gap. So this is the idea that the fact that women are expected to stay home and care for the children, the women are the ones who birth children. There is a pay gap, there is a motherhood gap, which is again like the gender pay gap, but for women who have had children. Okay, remember, you don't have to remember all of those. You can pick some of them, and if you want to explore, there is some discussion about the gender pay gap and the concept of it and whether it exists, although a lot of that comes from from confusion and the lack of understanding that is the average pay of men and women that are compared, not specific men and women. You're welcome to do some research on that, and I'm more than happily accept that. As a however, there is clear impact of gender bias that does exist, but you could also say that some people challenge that if you can find some well-conducted non-biased research. There is also evidence that challenges the idea of gender bias, so challenges the idea of the concept that men and women are different. And this was a meta-analysis conducted by Hyde in 2005. So meta-analysis, as I'm sure you know, is when all of the research in an area that's been conducted on a specific thing, so looking at different gender differences, and they put all of the research together and are able to provide really clear answers rather than one study here, one study there. It's all of the studies considered considered as a whole and reflected on. And they found that there is more, men and women have more alike than they are different. So there are more similarities, and there is some research here. So there are a very small number of things where men and women are different. So men were found in research to be able to throw further. They were more physically aggressive, they masturbated more, and they held more positive views about sex in uncommitted relationships, which you could argue links back to this idea that that's being reinforced as appropriate because of the sociobiological theory. And also Hyde found that gender differences fluctuate massively over different variables such as time and age. There's no stable gender differences that exist throughout all of people's lives, therefore calling into question the existence of them, because if they were differences, they should exist forever. And most significantly, when they were when people were taking part in research where they were told they couldn't be identified by gender, it was either found that there was no difference in the way that people behaved, or interestingly enough, there was actually a reversal, and women, for example, in this study were more aggressive and men were more passive. So that challenges that idea of gender differences, and particularly those traditional gender roles. Okay. A strength of discussing, or a positive of discussing gender bias, or acknowledging that gender bias exists, is that we would work hard to reduce gender bias. And a particular branch of psychology that exists to reduce gender bias is feminist psychology. And the key thing they are there to do is to encourage the re-examination of blindly accepted theories. So one of the theories they've pushed really hard to have re-examined and better research conducted on is Darwin's theory. So this sociobiological theory, particularly of sexual selection, which is this idea of looking for short-term or long-term mates that we discussed in the AO1. So the feminist psychologists have pushed to have this re-examined, and consistently research that's been done in a more modern era hasn't found to support Darwin's claims of men only look for short-term relationships and women look for long-term relationships. Also, they've pushed for more appropriate research methods to be used. So consistently it's been found that women don't do as well in lab settings because there is a shift in the power balance. So consistently it's found to be that it's men who are the research assistants, and the power imbalance is felt more strongly by women because they're more conscious they're being watched, and if they make a mistake on a task, so it can impact their performance. So there's been a real push in feminist psychology to conduct research in real life settings, which of course is a positive because it increases the ecological validity, and it's a more fair setting for people to, for both men and women, a fair footing, although obviously a flaw of that is that lab studies are more controlled. So it might call into question the fact there's more extraneous variables there. And of course, a key thing about acknowledging that gender bias exists is there are huge benefits of challenging gender bias that don't only apply to the idea that of men and women and gender differences, but to the whole of psychology. So if we acknowledge gender bias and other bias exist, then we would strive for better research. So particularly we would improve and have more representative samples. And as you know, if samples are more representative, they're more generalizable, so they increase the population validity of the research and therefore the validity of any theories based on that research. So it's a really significant move forward, and we do just generally collect more valid research. And there's a move in a huge number of areas, not just psychology but education as well, for reflexive practice. And this is the idea that we should, if we're reflexive, we acknowledge that we as researchers have bias which exist, we acknowledge them, and then we embrace them and use them appropriately. So for example, if we're men conducting research, we would acknowledge that there was some bias within our in the conclusions that we draw and the way we conduct research. And also if we are women, we would acknowledge there'll be some bias in the way that our research is conducted as well. And if you can remember, some of these will very much also apply to culture bias that we look at next year. Also, One that I forgot to put in, but it's really key, an impact of gender bias is, and those traditional stereotypical roles, is there is actually, it has negative impacts not only on women, so there's inequality in the workplace, but also on men, and generally disproportionately, although in a much broader context, not just this, gay men. So this is the idea that they don't follow the traditional masculine roles. They are considered more feminine, and we're talking in very stereotypical terms here. Hopefully that's not so much the case, but and there is a very high suicide rate in male young men who are gay. Also, there is generally quite a high suicide rate, and that's because of this stereotypical view that if you're a true man, you don't talk about your feelings and your emotions, and that is having a massive impact on young men. So you think about boys don't cry and those kind of old-fashioned statements that are still used today, and they stop men from seeking help for their mental health. So having this negative view of women and one of the feminine traits being discussing your emotions, and the fact that that's associated with women and therefore a negative trait to have, particularly if you're a man, is having an impact on men, a negative impact on men as well as women. So that's another point that you could use if you prefer to, rather than the workplace bias as well. Okay, so that is your first exploration of one of the issues in Issues and Debates. I hope you enjoyed it, because you've got quite a few more topics to go. Thank you very much.